I want to introduce you to Dr. Bob Weber. Dr. Weber is the department head at the Kansas State University. Sorry, I get that correct. Also at the Eastern Kansas Research and Extension Center. I got to meet Bob while he was at the University of Missouri and shared an office suite with him, so got to follow a lot of stuff his work early on. So Bob's going to talk about genetic selection for cow fertility and longevity, which I'm really excited to hear about today.
Great. Well, thank you, Dan, and appreciate the invitation from the host committee to come be with you today. I have to say this is a nice reprieve from administrative duties. So it's great to see a lot of old friends and a colleague here in the audience, and it makes me happy to be here and join you. And I appreciate Matt's comments a lot. Of course, he and I have worked together for a long time, and I always appreciate Matt's really pragmatic approach to genetic improvement. And I want to emphasize one of the points that he made, not so subtly, but I'll reiterate it. A while back, I was on somebody on a Facebook group who made a comment. Every once in a while, I try and stay out of that riffraff as much as possible, but sometimes there's just something that's like, this is not right, okay? And the comment was they were bemoaning this run up in mature cow weights related to increased selection for growth, and particularly carcass weight, trying to make that connection. And I tried to explain to them in a fairly polite way that you don't have to take that, right? You can make selection decisions and separate this maternal and terminal mating decision, just as Matt described, and actually make pretty big carcasses in a terminal mating decision from modest sized cows. And that if you really want to make cows adapted to the production environment, you've got to start thinking about making cows adapted for the production environment, not focusing all of your selection weight at the far end of the chain. And that you ought to use some like advanced reproductive technologies, gender sort semen, and estrus synchronization to manage that process, right? It's a convenient way to do that. And the response was, we can't do that in the United States, right? That's too expensive, da 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 da. Well, if anybody in the audience recently calculated what is the cost per conception from average price bulls turned out on cows? Right? So if you're buying competitive, really high quality bulls, it is not difficult to spend $8,000, $9,000, $10,000 on a bull. Okay? Figure out how much, and salvage value, of course, is helping us a bit, right? The swap on bulls is reasonably favorable. But figure out the depreciation cost between purchase price and sale price and allocate that against the calves, expected calves that bull produced over his lifetime, and figure out that number. It is not a lot different than a estrus synchronization project using a seeder with the labor and reasonably priced seed. They're not that different. Okay? So the idea that we can't do that, if that includes the labor, it's a push, right? Except for it's not, right? You have much better control on the maternal mating component if you use gender sort semen. You can be a lot more choosy in what bulls you use. So I was a little like, but then I'm like, I get to go to North Platte soon. So I'm probably preaching to the choir a little bit here, but I think it's a really important perspective for us to remember that, making some kind of assumption about we can't do X, we are in a completely different market space than we were a decade ago. Okay, and the way we ought to think about investment and genetic improvement and management really needs to have numbers tied to it and realistic numbers. And I appreciate Matt's comments relative to thinking about separating these decisions, because I think it's really important as we move ahead. We are not going to be happy with the cows that we make when we have to have carcasses that weigh 1,200 pounds. I don't know if 1,200 is a realistic number in the future. But there's a lot of push to keep making cattle bigger to meet supply requirements or supply from the market space. And we can't change inventory rapidly, right? The only way we can change the amount of beef that gets pushed through a packing plant is change outweight. Okay, and that's in fact what we've been doing. So this leads to my first slide, right? We can't solve the problems of the day with the same thinking that created them, right? And so I want us to move to, we'll use Albert Einstein terminology, an enlightened perspective, okay, on hopefully how we think about selection for maternal genetics. Now that kind of sets up the talk with some high expectations. What most I'm going to tell you today, you already know, okay? I'm going to remind you of some of those things that I think are really important as we move ahead in selection for cow longevity and fertility, okay? As Matt pointed out, ebeef.org and the sire selection manual, a good resource if you have insomnia. This is a great solution. I'm kidding. It's a really good resource. Some of you in the front got that. That's good. A good resource available online, ebeef.org. Okay. So overview. We're going to talk just a minute about this idea, and I put sustainability in here, and I'm not necessarily talking about sustainability from the environmental or animal health perspective. I'm talking about sustainability from is your business profitable over time perspective. Okay, so as a cow-calf producer, most of us have some idea that we're going to pass this ranch on to our children, or hopefully their grandchildren, or our grandchildren. And so we've got this longer term perspective about how we need to be profitable and certainly survive the ups and downs of the seasonality of our beef production system. So we're going to talk about why that's important and the value of that. We're going to talk about systematic selection as part of that strategy. And I want to emphasize clock's ticking, right? There are some decisions that if we would have made 4 or 5 years ago could rapidly or radically change revenue stream in our farm or ranch today, given what today's market prices are, right? So if you could roll time back and go, okay, let's make a production decision where we've got 20% more calves to market, okay, or 15% heavier calves, or some combination of inventory and weight, would you do that? Right? I mean, who would have guessed we'd have $4 5-weight calves, right? My brother Dave, the economist, even didn't get that right. Okay. So thinking ahead and planning is key to this exercise, particularly in the long plan. I appreciate Matt's look at this idea of planning horizon, because oftentimes we get sucked into making a decision about the market or something that's happening that's got a 1 or 2 year time frame on it, and not thinking about the long play in our business. Okay. And then at the end here, hopefully talk about some what I think is fairly practical advice on things we can do today to impact our selection. So why is selection then genetic improvement part of the sustainability solution? Well, 2 things. One, we've relied on genetic improvement to sustain our business over time, make it profitable. And we can certainly put in some of the social and environmental components in this discussion as well. And we've made improvements in those through improvements of profitability in a commodity business, right? If you think at the end of the day, cow-calf production is a carbon-based economy, okay? So the more we do to improve the input-output relationship between the grass we grow, however we do that, and the pounds of beef we produce, we improve these sustainability metrics. And so much of what we talk about in extension, from improvements in reproductive efficiency, feed efficiency, nutrition management, animal health, all help us improve these sustainability metrics, okay? The other bit here is, and a number of folks point to this, that genetic improvement is permanent and additive, and I always put the little thing at the end, so long as we don't mess it up, right? But we can make substantial modification and change if we keep after it and use dedicated and reliable tools to make that improvement. Okay. The last point on here, though, is should we be satisfied with the tools we have? And I think, and particularly in this maternal space, we need better tools. We need better tools on female longevity and productivity and fertility, and measures that are tied to the genetic relationship between those traits and profitability at the cow-calf level. We need better tools for genetic prediction of male fertility as well. So we have work to do, certainly. And we certainly have work to do in terms of the adoption of technology, particularly selection index, as we think about making breeding and management decisions at the cow-calf level. Okay. I want us to go back, though, to the fundamentals, right? And no better place to do that in the sandhills of Nebraska, right? The magic of this part of the world is we turn out cows on non-human edible feedstuffs and make a high-quality, fantastic product, okay? So we can't lose focus of cow as harvester, right? And we ought to think about, well, how do we make this animal the most suited genetically and environmentally, so the things we interact with our animals in terms of nutrition and animal health and handling and so forth, to do the best job producing a calf, right? So if we think about the idea of biological efficiency, it's that measured as reproductive rate. And that's central to what we're doing here today, right? I used to have this slide as the ideal beef cow. I think it's the sustainable beef cow. And it's one that is environmentally adapted, that we have an opportunity to make a really strategic mating decision to produce a high quality calf, right? So there's kind of this two-piece selection that goes into that breeding program, right? How do we make really high quality adapted replacement females, or purchase them, whatever, okay? And then how do we make those cows? Those are two decisions, right? So often in our business, we tackle that as one decision. It's a one bull fits all sort of solution. And that is getting more and more difficult to do today. If we want to make these really environmentally adapted cows, they're a lot different than the genetics that make the ideal beef carcass, okay? And so we need to separate that. To that end, we also need the importance of phenotypic. There's a number of seat stock folks, and Jerry, great to see you, in the audience. Our job is to make genetic packages, right? Seat stock breeder, right? That hopefully set a customer up for success. But as a commercial cattleman, it's phenotypes that pays the bills, right? So it's selecting the right genetics that go into our production system, managing them in an appropriate way that is most optimized against a profit stream that makes things happen, right? And don't lose sight of that. The component of genetics, and we'll talk more about this in a second, is we get focused sometimes in the additive space or using EPDs and selection indexes on things that we think are important, and sometimes they turn out to be important for somebody else in the value chain, okay? And that's okay to some extent. But if we want to really optimize profit in the calf sector, we really need to focus on profit in the cow-calf sector, okay? Tools, okay? So we forget sometimes that there's this non-additive pool of genetic resource that has a substantial impact on the productivity of the cow-calf sector, and we leave that out of the conversation, and that's a mistake. And we'll talk about that and the value proposition sense here in just a minute. You know, you can come to a talk and not hear a little piece at least about crossbreeding, the value of heterosis, okay? The last piece here then is this improvement of management. And no doubt we've made massive improvement over time in the way that we manage cattle, okay? If you think about the value of animal health programs, nutrition, production management, grazing management, all the things we do at ranch level make a better environment for our cow, or have an opportunity to, and that's really important. I want to focus it just a second, and think about kind of the system level idea of changes in reproductive rate or percent calf crop weight. The other thing I want you to leave today with is, you know, it is so easy, and we do this all the time, and I'm guilty as anybody, getting focused on the individual cow, okay, and what she does. That's important, but the interaction of that group of cows and the number of cows we're able to operate on our fixed land base, which most of us operate off a fixed land resource, matters, okay? And if we can think about, what if we change reproductive rate in 7%? Okay? How much is that worth? Okay? Because we've got two things at play here, right? We've got an opportunity to make investment in strategic components that change the environment of our cows. That might be, you know, protein supplementation, might be some winter hay feeding, how do we graze corn, whatever, okay? We have an opportunity to measure both the input cost that goes with that and what is the expected return, okay? Well, figuring out what the return, sometimes we just kind of ballpark it, right? And not the best strategy. But as an idea here, what if we change weaning rate 7%, okay? On 100 cows, that's 7 head of calves, okay? They weigh 500 pounds. I looked up yesterday, the Nebraska last week's 5 to 6 weight calf price was $410 a hundredweight, okay? That generates 14,000. What if it takes us $20,000 to achieve that? Okay. Yep. This side. How's that? Okay. I'll talk from this side. That's fine. I'm a lefty, so I have a tendency to migrate that direction. So I'll try and stay on this side. So that the proposition is that small changes in weaning rate has big impact on potential revenue, right? It gives us another calf product to sell. Okay. Another way to think about that is decrease in break-even unit cost of production, right? So it'd be about a $34 change. Okay. The key here is we need to think at the systems level, okay, and start to understand those trade-offs between inventory, price, investment to get there, and certainly we can't leave out the quality discussion, right? Sam Hands, who many of you know, was one of our speakers at the BIF meeting, and he said it maybe as good as I've ever heard. Pounds pay the bills, quality sets the price. Okay, which is a really good perspective, right? We can have both of those things. We can build a really high quality, high value feeder cattle and make a lot of them at the same time. Okay, we should have our perspective right. So I want us to think about, I mentioned the long play, right? And long play selection decisions are important in our business. Matt made a great point about, the dairy industry has done a great job exploiting genomic tools, making substantial selection on sex limited traits that have long-term investment strategies. We can do the same thing in beef cattle, right? Some of our fertility traits like stability or functional longevity, whatever trait you want to call that, has relatively low heritability, but has substantial impact on our replacement costs. And subsequently, if we decrease the number of replacements that are required in our herd, that does what to revenue? It changes it two ways, right? It decreases the investment we have to make in replacement heifers, but it also gives us another piece of inventory to market, right? And so we've got to focus on both of these. And so I wanted to just kind of point out sort of the short-term, long-term opportunities that exist for us in terms of both difficulty and impact, right? So if we think about heifer pregnancy, if that's something important to us, heterosis, we get about a 7% improvement in first service conception rate in heifers, or a 5% improvement in heifer pregnancy in a 45-day breeding period. Not insignificant, certainly. If we do that in a selection strategy using heifer pregnancy, we can achieve an 8% move, but that's breed average to the top 1% of the breed, right? We got to move our herd from breed average, the whole herd, to the top 1% to achieve a relatively equal amount of improvement in fertility performance. So what I'm hoping to get to you here is there's two pieces at play, right? There's the additive and non-additive, okay? So heterosis and traditional selection. And there's different timelines that are related to those improvements, right? Should we ignore one or the other? No. We should go after both pieces of this, right? Cow longevity, same kind of argument, right? We can change this rapidly with heterosis effect, about a 16% improvement using F1 cows. That's about a year, almost a year and a half improvement in longevity, okay, based on a reproductive culling strategy, okay? If we do it via selection, so think stability, okay, we can make, and this is, remember, I probably should look this up, this is from a few years ago, but the point still stays, about a 9% improvement if we go from average to the top 1%, this was in Simmental, okay? So just a little over half the amount of gain. How long is it going to take us to move a herd that's average on stability, the whole herd, to the top 1% in terms of genetic merit? I don't know, that's probably a 4 or 5 generation turnover thing, right? So in a commercial level, that's a 30-year exercise, right? Should we go after that? We should go after some of that, certainly, okay? But we need to think about how do we implement those short-term, long-term play, okay? The other piece I want to argue for a little bit, and for the animal breeders in the room, I think we need to do more in this space, but we need help from seed stock producers and commercial producers, and most certainly technology, okay? And that idea is that we have decent tools today, but we can make those tools a lot better with some stuff, right? One of those things is whole herd data reporting, doing a better job at the seed stock level about informing our selection system relative to cow performance and longevity, and culling data, okay? So really being able to try it that way. It is really sensitive. Disentangle the culling for performance and those related kind of issues versus culling for reproductive failure. Okay, so separating those a little bit from our current stability. The other bit's sort of novel trait development. I really appreciate, many of you know Warren Snelling. He's over at the Meat Animal Research Center. A number of years ago proposed a new trait using the existing data we already collect, right? So seed stock level, we get a massive amount of weaning weight information into the genetic evaluation. And he proposed, in addition to calculating a weaning weight and maternal or milk EPD, we actually ought to calculate two other traits that are related to cow herd productivity and reproductive performance. And those measures are cumulative days of age of the weaned calves, okay? So if we think about cows that are typically more profitable in our herd, they're cows that calved early in the calving season, right? So if you sum up the age of a cow's calves over time, a cow that's got older calves at weaning time is reflective of better reproductive performance, calving, rebreeding more quickly, staying at the beginning of the calf drop, okay? Good one. The other one is cumulative weaning weight, sort of the same argument, right? We expect cows that have older calves to wean off more calf weight at the end of the calving season, which is also advantageous to us, or at the end of the weaning period. So uses the same data, but just presents it in a new way that points us towards cows that we know perform better in our commercial cow-calf system, okay? The last piece here, and I'm going to talk more about mature cow weight in just a minute, is the improvement of what I call data density or reporting frequency. Of how much data do we actually have to calculate mature cow weight, body condition score, traits in our seed stock population? It's not anywhere close to enough. We publish those EPDs, but they are informed by a very small number of records reported annually. I would encourage you, if you're a seed stock producer and you want to get in front of this maternal cow argument, one of the easiest and most important things to do is start weighing cows, okay? That I think is really, really important. And as Matt pointed out in the selection index, whenever you do one of these that has a maternal component in it, mature cow weight ends up being the proxy for maintenance energy cost, okay? And it accounts for a huge component in those indexes. And so if we want to make improvement there, we really need to get our arms around that. Okay, Matt showed this equation before, and I think it's really important. You know, phenotype is genetics plus environment, and I really appreciate Matt's comments on sort of interpretation of heritability. That's really important as well. But if we take the genetic piece and break it apart, right, there's three chunks in there. There's the additive component, that's what we use EPD selection index to describe, the dominance or heterosis kinds of effects from pairing of different genes, and then epistatic interaction. Our focus almost always goes to just the additive piece. And when we're doing individual animal selection, that's not wrong. What we need to do is step back one layer and do a better job thinking about our breeding objective and our breeding system that goes with that to make the structural changes in our breeding system to capture and leverage the heterosis or dominance effects that exist. So the reality is that as a commercial producer, we really need to focus on both additive and non-additive pieces of improvement, especially if we're interested in making environmentally adapted maternal type cows to do that. So utilization of selection index, obviously an important component of balancing those input-output relationships and taking care of putting the appropriate weight on each trait, but we also have to leverage heterosis, okay? As a seed stock producer, then our job should be to produce and document and market genetics that fit into those systems, right? We need to have both a good understanding of our own operation, but also that of our commercial customer and what they need to improve profitability at the cow-calf level and further on through the value chain. One of the biggest challenges we face is this competing, and I mostly put this in as a reminder for me, there's some numbers, they're important, but the point here is that if we're going to continue to select for increased growth performance in our cow or in our calf products and increased carcass weight, the expectation is if we don't do something, our cows continue to get bigger, okay? And by a show of hands, how many people in the room want their cows to get bigger and eat more groceries? Yeah, that's what I thought, nobody, right? Now, I should say that there are instances where bigger cows make sense, right? And it has a lot to do with your marketing strategy and what is going on with that relationship. But without just sitting down and figuring that out, it's pretty hard to say we want bigger cows, okay? And in general, the trend is actually the other direction in terms of at least the research data that I see. And we'll talk about some of that in just a minute. But the point is, if we don't make dedicated selection for things that are important to us, we are victim to the genetic trend or the genetic relationship that underlies those traits, right? So we know there's a strong positive relationship between yearling weight and mature cow weight. So if we want more yearling weight and we select for it, and we don't do anything about mature weight, cows are going to get bigger. Okay, that's just the facts. Okay, and so I encourage us to do more to manage that. And one of the tools, and Matt did a nice job talking about selection index. And selection index is really the tool, right? How many of us are comfortable with our seat of the pants assessment of, a 1,500 pound cow is too big? That's kind of a bold statement, right? Without some facts and knowledge of your operation, 1,500 pounds would be perfect. Probably not in most environments, but unless you do the work, you don't know. Okay, so selection index helps us sort that out and figure out what traits drive value into the system and ones that we need to change. I've talked about this idea of environmentally adapted cows, and I think it's a really important concept for us, particularly as we move from kind of eastern Kansas west, right? So figure for cow-calf producers, what is the optimal combination of genetic merit for all the growth and calving ease and maternal traits and carcass traits? How do we put that all together in a systematic way? And I kind of chalk it under this idea of build better cows. And it has to start with a philosophy of cows. Right? If your intent is to build high quality feeder cattle, you focus. If your objective is to focus on building high quality replacement heifers, you have to actually put emphasis into that, right? You got to put effort into that. It's not a de facto kind of fall from on high sort of exercise. You actually have to invest in that exercise in terms of particularly intellectual contribution, but also discipline to make it happen. Okay, and I want to remind us, and this is a slide I sort of adapted, is the nice word for extension seal, right? Adapted this from Tom Jenkins, who many of you know over at the Meat Animal Research Center. And he presented this at a BIF meeting, and I thought it was a really good way to think about it. And it's this idea of improvement in weaning weight per cow exposed, and breaking out sort of the maternal and terminal components here. So do I have a crossbred cow, and what is the value of that cow above and beyond having a crossbred calf? Okay, and that's this right-hand column, right? If we're in the literature says it's about a 23% improvement in the clay center environment, which arguably is a pretty good environment, right? So typically the literature says the more harsh that environment is, the bigger this number gets, right? And it's largely due to how do we make these cows more reproductively efficient, right? And reproductive rate is critical. And more than half of the effect then is due to having crossbred cows, okay? So we can't take that out of our vision, I think, as we build commercial cows. I updated this slide last night. I was going through my slides, and I didn't think, the last time I'd updated it, calves were worth $275 for 5 weights. Okay, I probably should look at that, because one of the arguments I get is, man, these $3 calves, I don't need heterosis. What? Right? Just because you're profitable now doesn't mean you're profitable through the whole chain, right? So adding value as a perspective, I think is really important, right? Like, I'd like my cow-calf operation to make money every year, not just in the year that calves are worth $4, right? Comments like that sort of make my head spin a little bit. And it's because of this, right? So here's an example. This is an 85% weaning rate, so it's a pretty productive herd. 575 pound calves, 10-year time horizon, 100 cows. If we just break out the literature and say, what is the contribution of crossbreeding system? This would be an F1 terminal sire system compared to straight-bred calves or straight-bred cows. Calf survival to weaning about 6%. Okay, over that 10 years, that's 50 calves, right? That's over half a pot load of 5-weight calves. Okay, weaning weight, so just the direct component, about 20,000 pounds of calf weight. We know in the F1 terminal sire system, this number is actually about 8%, so half from maternal heterosis and half from direct. So you could double that number. Weaning weight per cow exposed improvement, 23%. This is about 112,000 pounds of cumulative calf weight produced over that period. If you do the math backwards, that's about 20 more calves, equivalent of 20 more calves at 575 per year. Okay? This is the massive change in productivity. Okay? That heterosis then, so I looked it up last night, Nebraska average for 5 to 6 weight heifer calves. I used heifers. The steers are actually worth a fair bit more than this. I thought 410 was the optimistic anyway, but so if they're at 410, okay, the heterosis is worth $460 per cow per year. That's not over the cows per cow per year. Okay, that difference in productivity lets you buy, and I don't know if anybody's priced a new crew cab diesel dually pickup recently, even with like farm level trim, it's 80 grand, right? This lets you pay cash for a new one of those every 2 years on the economic difference. Okay. Is this worth going after? I heard somebody the other day and make this comment about working in the business or working on the business. This is a working on the business discussion. Okay. This is on 100 cows, 500 cow. This is massive. Oh, slide went away. The other piece is I always want to make sure, we're in the part of the world. How many of y'all retain ownership on calves? A few, okay? So the value at the far end of the chain is not unimportant to any of us in this room, okay? If you're thinking that I don't think the massive change in value we've seen from improving the quality of our product is unimportant to our business, it's massively important to our business, okay? Every dollar that comes to a cow-calf producer started with some consumer at a restaurant or a grocery store buying our product, okay? We can't forget that, okay? That's not lost on me. What's also not lost on me is that we can massively change our individual as a business ability to capture those dollars by changing the way we manage and produce calves at the cow-calf level, okay? What is our share of the pie, right? So we know we produce, let's say, 27 million head of feeder cattle in the United States. How do I get my chunk of that, okay? It is a competitive business. We also know that there's massive value creation at the far end of the chain. Improving quality is important. This relative to that endpoint. So to illustrate that, I back calculate how much would the feeder steer or heifer that dies on the rail have to generate in additional dollars to make up for the difference in productivity we captured at the cow-calf level using crossbreeding, okay? That's the trade-off in this decision, right? That difference is every one of those steers or heifers that goes to slaughter out of a straight breeding program has to generate $60 per hundredweight premium to make the system equal, okay? And if you're a retained ownership producer, the costs you incur aren't just the costs of feeding cattle at the feed yard, right? You got to pay for a whole cow herd and replacement female generation on the back end of the system. And the number of calves that you put into the market chain to achieve carcass weight and value at the end of the chain matters, okay? And so this is it's a pretty big number to overcome. Can we do it? Yeah. What we ought to do is maybe go after both, right? Remember Sam Hand's comment about pounds pay the bills, quality sets the price? To Matt's comment earlier, mature cow weight is of nutrition for that cow. And of course, most of that's grazed forage, and we have a tendency to sort of lose track of that because we don't measure it very effectively. But understanding and managing cow size is critical to our business, okay? This is some work actually out of Dave Wallman's lab at Oklahoma State. Dave talked to you yesterday. And it just illustrates the difference in the number if you've got a fixed resource base and you constrain nutrient availability to that fixed nutrient or fixed resource base, the effect on inventory by cow size, right? This is elementary science, right? If we make the cows bigger and they eat more, we can run less of them, okay? And as you go from a 1,000-pound cow to a 1,400-pound cow, that inventory, if you could run 1,000 or 100 head of 1,000-pound cows on that resource, you can really only run 71 head of 1,400 pound cows. Okay. If we assume the reproductive rate of those cows is equal, we've changed for easy math, right? They reproduced at 100%. Okay. We changed the number of calves we could sell by 29 head. Okay. Does that affect the revenue stream? Yeah. If you go in today's market, the gross dollars generated between a 3-weight, 4-weight, 5-weight, and 6-weight calf, let's call it within a margin of error equal, right? Those all have about the same value in the marketplace. What if I haul 29 more head to the sale barn? Okay, so we got to keep track of this. In a more complicated, this is some work that Dustin Ahern, he was a graduate PhD student with Bob Larson and I at K-State, built a really sophisticated, fully stochastic cow-calf production model, right? So stochastic, it measures the variation of the biological traits that go into this production model. It's a really great piece of software. And he looked at the returns, median annual return per grazing acre, right? So he was under this perspective to make this decision about what cow size actually made the most money in the Flint Hills of Kansas. Okay, and I apologize; these are all in kilograms. So this is a 1,000-pound cow. This one's a 1,700-pound cow. Okay. Well, what do you notice? And this is actually using real price and precipitation data through that time period. So this is from 2000 to 2018. Okay, and these are ordered. Each one of these sets of stacks is the smallest cow to the biggest cow. Okay. Well, two important things. The smallest cows didn't make the most money, and the biggest cows didn't either. Okay. In some years, when we were in a loss situation, they all lost about the same amount of money. But in the profitable years, the smaller cows made more net per acre for the ranch. Why? Gross pay weight of calves weaned, the total amount, so the interaction between number of head and the weight of those calves into the market space was the most desirable relative to the cost input to go into that, right? Because if we run more cows, do we spend more dollars on cow maintenance, right? Do we have more variable costs total? Yeah, because we got more cows, right? So we've got change in inventory that affects both the cost side of the equation and the revenue side. So we've got to sort that out, and that's what this model did, right? So we've got accounting of both the costs and the revenues to come up with this number. But it says in the Flint Hills of Kansas, a 1,700-pound cow sure is not the right choice, okay? And the ideal cow, actually, if you go and look at a couple of other metrics, is probably somewhere around 1,150 to 1,200-pound cows are the right size cows, Flint Hills of Kansas, okay? I want to get at this idea of both adaptation and risk management, okay? And I'll show you a slide that you all, in the next couple of slides, that you've seen 1,000 times. And it's this idea of controlling the things we can control, right? If we think about the interactions in our system based on cow energetics, right? So we've got a land resource base, calories consumed by graze forage that support a certain amount of cows, right? And we have choice relative to our selection for changes in lactation and mature cow weight, okay? And we know those differences are massive, right? So this is just NRC equations to calculate out the energy requirements for the whole production cycle for 1,000, 1,200, 1,400-pound cows at 3 different levels of lactation, right? So the going from here to here in weight is a 27% increase in nutrient requirement. From low milk to high milk is about a 16% in any one of these categories. If you combine that, that's a 43% change in nutrient requirement. Bigger, I'm not going to call her big, 1,400 pounds is about industry average now, bigger high milk cow, okay? That's of 1 ton of number 2 yellow corn energy equivalent, okay? So corn right now is not very expensive, but if you figure that out in energy equivalency, that's about 3.5 tons of prairie hay on a dry basis. That's a big difference in energetics. If you think about it, you spread that out over your whole ranch and 100 or 500 cows, this is a big deal in terms of energetics, okay? Y'all times, right? It's the Patsy Houghton and Selk slides that relate body condition score to reproductive performance, okay? If we overstock our ranch, we don't feed our cows enough, they get thin, then they don't what? They don't breed, right? They don't breed up very well. And we know this reproductive rate and biological efficiency that goes with it is central to the profitability of our ranch, right? So if we get cows down here in 3 and 4 body condition score because we didn't allocate enough feed to them, extended postpartum interval, decreased breed up, okay? You all have heard that 1,000 times, okay? My point here from a genetics perspective is part of that's our fault, right? If we don't make cows the right size for the production environment in terms of their nutrient requirement, there's 2 solutions to the problem, right? We either suffer low reproductive rate because cows are non-cyclical, okay? Or we have to haul them a bunch of harvested expensive feed, okay? But we have a tendency to go blame the cow, right? It's right. We're blaming the cow. There's one to her, and the idea of this adaptation of controlling the things that we can. How good is the tool for mature cow weight? It's pretty good. Heritability is like 0.6 or something, right? It's a crazy number. Okay? It doesn't take tons of cow data to get good mature weight estimates. We need more, as I said earlier, but it's something we can control, and we can control well, and we don't do a very good job of selecting for this in our system. Clay Mathis made a similar slide. In fact, I think the graphic over here I stole from Clay after this at Cattlemen's College luncheon a couple of years ago of contribution margin. And I always appreciate the perspective Clay brings to the cow-calf argument and discussion from the idea that it is this whole system, right? It's not, Clay almost never talks about the individual cow, it's the herd of cows, right? And their interaction in our resource and management. And contribution margin then is this additional revenue above variable costs as we expand production beyond covering fixed costs, okay? And it's the idea that the next cow doesn't add the same amount of profit to our system as the cow we added or the calf we added immediately before that, okay? If we're, well, assuming that we're in a positive net profit or net revenue situation, okay? So adding cows and sale weight has this sort of snowball effect on profitability. As you move away from break even, you get an acceleration of profitability in the system. So adding 1 or 2 or 3, because we did a good job in management or selection, breeding, whatever, has a big effect on profitability. And we, again, cannot take the individual animal perspective and get to the right decision point, right? So if I throw out to you the relationship between weaning weight and mature cow weight, it's positive, right? So if we look at the individual animal basis, our assumption would be, well, this is positive, we should select for bigger cows or more weaning weight, whichever way you want to think about that. But that's wrong thinking, right? Because we know when we put all the cows together, the relationship does what? It goes the other way, right? As we make cows bigger in the production system, their weaning weight per cow exposed goes down, okay? And it goes down rapidly when we exceed the point of diminishing returns or accumulation of nutrients into those cows based on what they can graze, okay? So this is a really important idea. Steve Radokovich, who many of you know, in 1984, if you want a really interesting historical read that's got future written all over it, go back and read this set of talks from the Beef Cow Efficiency Forum in 1984. Okay, there's some really prophetic stuff in there about how we need to think about cow-calf production. And Steve says efficiency has to be viewed from the operational standpoint and not from a per cow or per steer basis, right? We got to get our thinking right to solve the problem we've created. Okay, I want to spend just a few minutes here. I'm probably getting, I'm actually not doing too bad on time. I thought I was going to have way too many slides. Replacement selection. So Matt already talked about this, right? So the idea of heritability and environment. And it turns out if we start disentangling some stuff, there's some things that we've chalked up to environment that actually, if we think about it, we can control a piece of that genetically, okay? And it's, you'll have to bear with me to get through the thinking here a little bit. But from the genetic effect standpoint, we can talk about, heritability of stability, sustained cow fertility, functional longevity, any of those things. Heritability is relatively low, but a 1% move in those numbers has big impact because of the cost of replacement females, and the relative value or net present value of those females in the system. Okay, we know heterosis has a big value. We can control cow size and lactation effectively in our selection systems if we put our mind to it. But we can also affect then the environmental things about which females we put in the production system, right? Aside from the genetics, we know things we do from a managerial standpoint, i.e. which ones we picked and how we manage them up to that point, affect their lifetime productivity, right? So one of them's age at breeding, right? So we can think about that probably has a genetic component to it at some level, right? It's an interaction. When they were born in the calving distribution. So are we picking heifers in our fixed production system that were born early in the calf drop, right? So they're the most age advantaged when we go to breeding on them as replacement heifers, which means if they conceive early in the breeding season, they then subsequently do what? They calve early in the calf drop, right? Which gives them lifetime more opportunities. Sandy Johnson has a talk that she does that I love the math accounting of those. You know, a heifer that's born the last day of your calving season, I don't care how good she is, she probably needs to go work for somebody else. Because unless you're going to delay your breeding season, she has limited opportunities to get bred as a 2-year-old. That's just a function of gestation length and math, okay? It's not her fault. In fact, it's our fault, right? We picked her and we knew she was a bad bet, okay? So making sure that we pick the right ones from that standpoint is really important, okay? Certainly body condition score and its interaction on cyclicity and breeding capacity, really important. And that has a genetics component to it, right? If we think about, well, sometimes the thin cows were the big cows 2 years ago, right? And we just had, you had a drought or something went sideways. She didn't get enough groceries. She's now a thin cow, and that's at the end we have to own that, right? As the breeder, okay? Just some reinforcing data here. So this is Bob Cushman data in South Dakota State data. It's from a Cushman paper. You know, these cows that calving date as a heifer, right? They calved in the first 21 days. They had about a year longer productive life than the ones that calved after 42 days in their calving season as heifers. Okay, it's just because we picked the ones. You know, if you go and ultrasound a whole group of heifers and there's some that are really late bred, maybe we got to send them down the road, right? Keep the ones that are good bets. Okay, here's lifetime productivity of those. Impact on average weaning weight based on conception at first breeding, so as heifers, okay? Here out to age 6, the cows that conceived early, okay, had statistically heavier calf weaning weight, cumulative weaning weight over time. So picking which ones matters, right? So FPs here, so this is the application bit. Select heifers born early in the calving season, and I hear all kinds of excuses about why we can't do that. Well, we don't tag our calves. Well, tags have gone up in price, I understand, okay? But how difficult is it you don't even have to tag all the calves, right? Let's say we've got a really well-managed operation and half of our calves land in the first 42 days of the calving season, okay? What if we just tag all the late-born calves, okay? So we know they come in the heifer pen at replacement time and they got an ear tag in them, we don't keep them, okay? Or you can do it the other way around, whichever you like, okay? There's ways to manage that aren't complicated, okay? And it turns out that if you go and even, so we did as part of my PhD project, a real in-life thing, can we guess the age of calves at branding time based on how big they are? Because we were trying to do a proxy for birth date, just by size at branding time. Keith Long did the calls, about 400 head. We were pretty good. Calves, putting them in, were they born the first 21, the middle 21, or 42 days or later? Okay, we missed about 5% of getting them in the right category. Okay, size isn't a bad proxy. Okay, if you want to control mature weight, certainly doing something about understanding adjusted weaning weights and productivity of those cows, right? If we go to the replacement pen and we pick off the biggest, fleshiest heifers, What have we just done? Well, we've probably picked some of the oldest ones, right? Age advantage matters. But we may have also picked heifers that came out of the highest growth, heaviest lactating cows in our cow herd, which if we're trying to control those two things may not be the best bet, right? So apply some data if we can to those decisions to help us, okay? Other things, if we're in the idea of crossbreeding and utilization of AI to build one of these maternal breeding systems, for sure pick those heifers, right? Like if you're gonna make all the investment in those decisions, preferentially select those. Select heifers from service sires with favorable fertility longevity EPDs, right? So go into the breeding decision to build those replacement heifers with the right bulls, right? Don't make a terminal breeding decision and then go back and sort heifers out of that. That's the wrong way around, right? Be intentional in the breeding decision to make maternal cows. Otherwise, it won't happen, okay? There's enough other drivers in our production system and decision making, we will lose track of that, okay? If you care about cows perform maternally, that has to be a priority in the selection decision, otherwise it'll get lost, okay? And then lastly here, let's use the right tools, right? So Matt talked about iGenDeck, and I use iGenDeck a lot with some of my consulting clients to build selection index that appropriately weights the value of the maternal contribution and the value of the revenue generating economically relevant traits, okay? So getting that balance right is critical, okay? Tools that we can use, right? So genetic progress is slow, so we have to be intentional on what bulls we use. How do we pick those then from a DNA perspective? Sorting out which ones are the most desirable can have a huge impact on our long-term success, especially if we're trying to manage variation in, say, coat color, right? We want to produce all, say, black-hided calves. Well, then we can't tell necessarily who is the service sire based on coat color, right? So use tools to help us determine which ones those are. And these aren't inexpensive tools, but relative to a $3,000 replacement heifer, a $10 or $15 investment so I know who she is genetically, probably makes some sense, okay? Last thing here, and I think there's John in the back. John, thank you. I can share this slide with you later if you haven't already made one, but I want to invite you. I'm the exec for the Beef Improvement Federation. Our annual meeting next year is in Boise, Idaho, downtown at their beautiful conference space, June 1st through 3rd. And if you've been following BIF, cow and cow efficiency, maternal performance has been a big topic of conversation for us the last couple of years, and I'm sure will continue to be at our meeting in Boise. We'd welcome you to join us. BIFsymposium.com is where you can find more information. We'll have program and registration stuff up sometime after the first of the year. So thank you very much.